Okay, I think we're almost there at that 100 mark, so I'm gonna kick this session off. So firstly, a huge warm welcome to all of you, to Gender Networks members and their committees and their guests. So this session was born after a conversation that we had back in March, just at the end of International Women's Day week, where we witnessed the terrible event, Sarah Everard's death, and also the subsequent demonstrations and how that was handled by the police. And on that kind of gender networks meeting that we was having, we got onto the topic of sexism and wider things in society. So at Gender Networks, we thought it would be a great idea to invite in my mind, one of the UK's most fantastic experts on the topic, just to give you this bonus session, to give you kind of a state of the nation on sexism in society. So it gives me huge pleasure to welcome Laura Bates. I've known Laura for a number of years, been a huge fan of her work. So Laura is founder. Sorry, if everyone could just go on mute, that would be fab. So Laura is the founder of the Everyday Sexism Project, which she founded back in 2012. She's a British feminist writer. The aim of the website is that basically people or women from all over the world can post their experiences. And if you have a chance, and Leona will pop the website link into the chat, go on and look at some of those experiences. It really brings to life just how prevalent sexism still is in society and how much work that we have to do. So I'm going to hand over to Laura. Leona will also pop links into the chat of her book, which you can get on Amazon, which is Everyday Sexism, and also her new book, Men Who Hate Women. So Laura's going to give us, Laura, if I could welcome you.
And hi, everyone.
Hi, could I just ask, Laura, but just before you begin, Leona, can you send a broadcast to get everyone to put themselves on mute, please? Or mute everyone, other than Laura. Everyone's on mute except for me. So, Laura, over to you.
Thank you so much, and many apologies. I think I dropped out for a moment there. We had a bit of an internet fluctuation at my end, but back again now, so hopefully that won't happen again, but I will quickly return if it does. Thank you so much for having me. Thank you everybody for coming. I want to give you a little bit of a background and overview of the Everyday Sexism Project and of where I'm coming from, and then I'm going to look a little bit more specifically about some of the findings of the project and the ways in which some of these issues show up in the workplace and what we can do about it more specifically. For me, the project started in early 2012, and honestly, it grew out of a really terrible week where by sheer coincidence, a number of things happened within a very short space of time. The first was that I was on my way home one day when a man started following me and started quite aggressively sexually propositioning me, refusing to take no for an answer. And eventually, when I asked him to leave me alone, said, "I'm going to follow you home and then I'll always know where you live." And a few nights later, I was on my way home on the bus quite late at night on the phone to my mum, very much in that bubble of being on the phone where you don't really notice what's going on around you, until I suddenly felt something and looked down and realized that the man next to me had his hand on my leg and was quite swiftly moving his hand inside and up my leg to grab my crotch. So I moved away from him, and in a moment of sort of shock and horror, I said what was happening out loud because I was on the phone to my mum in a way that perhaps I wouldn't have done otherwise. I said, "I'm on the bus. This man has just groped me." And everybody on that bus heard, and everybody looked away. They looked out the window, they looked down at their phones. Nobody stepped in, nobody challenged him, nobody suggested there was anything out of the ordinary, nobody even made eye contact with me. And it sent a very powerful message about normalization. It felt that they were saying, this is your thing, don't bring this into the public domain, you deal with this yourself. It made me feel incredibly embarrassed, awkward, ashamed, uncomfortable, that perhaps I shouldn't have said anything, that maybe it was my own fault, that I was in the wrong place at the wrong time. And I got off the bus at the next stop and I walked the rest of the way home. And doing the job I do now and working with many young people in schools, I now understand that what happened on the bus that night was a sexual assault, that under UK law, if somebody touches another person anywhere on their body and the touching is sexual in nature and the person doesn't consent and the person doing the touching doesn't have reason to believe that they consent, that that's a sexual assault. And I think it's really telling and significant that it never would have crossed my mind at the time to describe what was happening as a sexual assault. And of course, I now work with thousands of young women every year and teenage girls, the majority of whom have had similar experiences, but wouldn't use the term sexual assault to describe what had happened to them, which I think is such a huge example of the ways in which we normalize sexism, sexual harassment, sexual assault from an incredibly young age in our society, to the point that we think of these things as something that you would simply look out of the window if it was happening, to the point that people, when it happens to them, don't necessarily have the language to describe it or the confidence to know that they could report it. But at the time, I just got off the bus at the next stop and walked the rest of the way home. And a few days later, I was walking down the street and some scaffolding was being unloaded from the back of a lorry. And as I walked past, perhaps within 1 meter of the men working together on the back of the truck, they started explicitly describing my body, pieces of my body, things that they would do to me. And again, it was that word normal that popped into my head. It seemed so strange to me that this was so normal and so acceptable that there wasn't any sense of embarrassment on their part. They didn't seem to think that I might respond or object in any way. It was just completely normal that as a woman in a public space, that was what my body was there for. And at the end of this week, I sat down and I was thinking about these 3 incidents that had happened. And what really struck me was that if they hadn't happened in such a short space of time, I probably never would have thought twice about any one of those incidents, because it was normal, because so many similar things had happened over the months and years during my time at school, at university in Cambridge, where I had a supervisor who wore a black armband every year to mark the day that women had been admitted to the college, where my boyfriend went to the end of year football dinner and came back with a spray painted gold trophy, which was the under the thumb award in this shape for the player who'd wasted too much time with his girlfriend, when my dissertation supervisor sent me an email to arrange our first tutorial saying, let's meet at the front gates of college. I'll bring a red rose, you bring a copy of yesterday's Telegraph. So many incidents that I'd never had the confidence to name or to relate to one another, to join the dots and make the connections, because it was normal and I'd grown to accept that this was just part of being a woman. And it was just enough for me to start asking a very simple question. I started asking other people, particularly women and girls, have you ever experienced anything like this? And I honestly thought that a few of them would have a story to tell me, a specific story from a different time in their life. A few years ago, this happened, or I once had a job where this happened. And the reality took me completely by surprise. It was every woman I spoke to. And it wasn't one story from a few years ago. It was, well, on my way to meet you just now, this happened. Yesterday, this happened. How many stories do you want? But many people made a point of saying to me, until you asked me, I've never told anyone any of these stories before, because it's normal. And it wasn't just experiences that had happened in public space. One woman who worked in the city told me, well, my male colleagues go to a strip club at lunchtime and take clients there, so I simply miss out on those deals. Another woman said that in her workplace, when women were coming in to be interviewed for roles in her team, her male colleagues would print their photographs off from the application form and hold them up and give them ratings out of 10 across the office. And when I asked them, isn't there anything you could do? Isn't there any route to complain about this? They said, probably technically, officially, but you just wouldn't have a long career at the company if you did. You'd be a troublemaker, a ball breaker, a feminazi, overreacting, rocking the boat, making a fuss about nothing. Everybody else laughs it off. Everybody sees it as banter. So to raise it would be really difficult, and it would really kind of mark you out. And many people had stories of having tried to challenge this stuff, particularly when they were younger, when it first started happening, and being asked, well, did you lead him on? What were you wearing at the time? Had you been flirting with him? Or perhaps you need to learn to take a compliment. He probably just meant it as a joke. Maybe you've got the wrong end of the stick. There are so many varied reasons why women are often silenced, shamed, blamed, disbelieved, dismissed, that eventually we learned to stop telling the stories at all. And that had led to this situation where I suddenly, almost by accident, uncovered this sort of mosaic of experiences that were rolling out in front of me like a map. And yet that so few of us had ever vocalized or even told anyone about, because we had been so indoctrinated to believe, firstly, that it was normal, and secondly, that we would be blamed or ignored if we did try to speak up. So it seemed to me that it was worth speaking up, that there was something bigger going on here, that far from my original assumption that I was just unlucky or that perhaps I was doing something wrong, this was actually something having a massive impact on women and girls' lives on a day-to-day basis. But people didn't know about it. And what that meant was that when I tried to talk about it, when I tried to start speaking about sexism, because it seemed to me that that was the word here, that we were talking about people being treated differently or discriminated against because of their sex, there was a real backlash. People said sexism doesn't exist anymore. Women are equal now, more or less. Women have completely equal opportunities. Look at other countries if you want to find real problems facing women. Women here have never had it so good. You don't know how lucky you are. And there seemed to be a kind of corresponding assumption that if you were a woman talking about sexism in this country in particular, you must be making a fuss about nothing, getting your knickers in a twist, and so on. Hopefully some slides will be popping up in front of you any moment now. Do let me know if you can't see them. But I decided to start looking into this, and I started to look at the kind of obvious place. I tried to interrogate this idea that women are completely equal now and there isn't any problem, because that seemed to me to be the biggest reason why we were being told that we couldn't talk about sexism. And I started looking in the obvious places, the places where power is concentrated, and found that actually, even after our most recent election, just a third of our MPs are women. And until that most recent election, there were more currently sitting male MPs in the Houses of Parliament than there have ever been female MPs in all of history. Only around a quarter of the members of the House of Lords are women. So in other words, the people making decisions that affect our lives on a daily basis in enormous ways are not really representative of the community that they serve. And the same is true in a number of other spheres where, again, we're talking about power and decision making. For example, just 7 out of 38 Lord Justices of Appeal are women, 18 out of 108 High Court judges, and there are over 3 times as many men named John running FTSE 100 companies in the UK as all the women put together. But I knew, of course, that if I took these statistics back to the people who'd accused me of overreacting and making a fuss about nothing, they would likely accuse me of cherry picking, suggest that I'd chosen male-dominated spheres, but that perhaps men were more likely to go into those spheres or performing better than women, that there would be other areas that were female-dominated and things would even out across the board. So I thought, let's take a look at some of those areas where you might stereotypically expect to find all the women clustered, and found that it really wasn't the case, that it didn't stand up to scrutiny. At our National Gallery at the time, out of 2,300 works, the collection contained paintings by just 10 women. At our Royal Opera House, it had been over 14 years since a female choreographer was commissioned for the main stage. And out of almost 600 commemorative statues around the UK of people of interest and inspiration, just 15% of them are of women. Just 2 of nearly 600 show a named Black woman. And it really persists everywhere you look. Far from cherry picking, you find that fewer than 1/10 of our engineers are female, that the Royal Society, our most important scientific institution, has never had a female president, and just 6% of its fellowship are women, that women are 50% of chemistry undergraduates. So this argument that they just don't go into particular fields or they're not particularly skilled really doesn't stand up to scrutiny. But they're just 6% of chemistry professors. So something else is clearly going on in between. Even in the media, of course, another concentrated seat of power, perhaps not hard political power, but soft power, certainly. And an area where I think you might have expected to see more gender parity, I found that women wrote just 1/5 of front page newspaper articles, and that almost 90% of those front pages we read are about a man. They're dominated by a male subject or a male expert. We don't tend to hear women's stories, another source of power in our society, the sharing of stories, because they only direct, write, or produce between 5 and 10% of the major Hollywood films that come out every year. We don't necessarily hear their voices in those films in the same way because they only take 28% of speaking roles, but they are 3 times more likely than men to have to take their clothes off on screen. Just 1/5 of UK architects are women, but 63% of those female architects report experiencing sexual harassment in the workplace during the course of their career. And finally, I came to these statistics, which felt very significant in the light of that common argument that we should look elsewhere if we want to find real problems affecting women, that women in the UK are making a fuss about nothing. Because that's a very common perception. And yet we live in a country where there's a phone call to the police every minute about domestic violence, where every 3 days on average, a woman is murdered by a current or former partner, where over 400,000 women are sexually assaulted and over 85,000 raped every year, where a woman has a 1 in 4 chance of becoming a victim of domestic violence and a 1 in 5 chance of being the victim of a sexual offence. So the notion that we simply shouldn't make a fuss about this because women are equal now really isn't founded when you look at the statistics, when you look at the facts. But if you try to push on regardless and talk about these issues, you tend to come up against another objection, which is the argument that you must hate men. The idea that feminism is irrevocably anti-man, that it's in opposition to the issues affecting men and boys, that this is a battle of the sexes, a gender war, and you have to pick a side. And this is something that's compounded by media coverage, frankly, that does sort of whip up those kinds of clickbait controversies for the sake of eyeballs and advertising clicks. But the reality, if you look at it, is very much the opposite. We are very much all on the same side. Partly because some of the issues we talk about when we're talking about gender equality or about sexism tend to be wrongly labelled women's issues, but actually impact people of all genders. Body image is a very good example of this. We would tend to think of body image as a teenage girls issue, as a campaign around body image being a kind of women's rights issue. But the truth is that actually the impact of negative body image and pressure around body image on men and boys is massive and fast increasing. So the first thing is that a lot of the battles that we're fighting are for everybody and would support and be beneficial for everybody. And then there are issues that do specifically and disproportionately impact boys and men. And very often online in particularly, you might see these issues being held up as kind of trump cards against feminism, used to undermine conversations around women's rights. So the male suicide rate is a very good example of this. It's obviously a hugely urgent, tragic issue. The male suicide rate is over 3 times higher than it is for women. But in the online narrative, what that shows is that men are the real ones with problems and that these whining women are making a fuss about nothing and trying to victimize women when really they've never had it so good and it's men who need help. The narrative is that these are completely polarized issues and you have to pick a team, that you either are a feminist and you talk about women's rights in which you callously disregard and don't care about the issues affecting men, or you acknowledge and care about the problems that men and boys face and recognize that feminism is a kind of vast and completely created conspiracy that tries to suggest that women are unhappy when really it's men who need support. The truth is that both of these issues are closely and deeply connected. So take that high male suicide rate, for example. All of the research, all of the experts, everything that we have points to the fact that one of the biggest drivers of that is bringing up boys in a society that teaches them boys don't cry, men are tough and manly and shouldn't talk about their feelings, shouldn't be vulnerable, shouldn't reach out for help. And that's borne out in the statistics. So we know that men are far less likely to receive support for mental health problems than women are. Even at the point that they reach university, fewer than 1/3 of counselling appointments through university services for young people are taken by male students. In other words, it comes down to a gender stereotype, which of course doesn't exist in a vacuum. Gender stereotypes are always 2 sides of a coin. In this case, the other side of the idea that men are tough and boys don't cry being the idea that women are over-emotional, that women are hormonal and hysterical and can't control their emotions, particularly around a certain time of the month. So the reality is that at the root of the very different issues that we're talking about affecting men and affecting women are the same outdated stereotypes, the same constrictions holding all of us back. So this is not about men against women, it's about people standing up to prejudice. It's a battle for all of us, and it should have massive benefits for all of us. But how do you begin to tackle a problem if people won't acknowledge that the problem exists? That was the problem I was then faced with. I'd looked into it. It seemed to me that the argument we shouldn't make a fuss didn't stand up to scrutiny. So how do you move forward trying to tackle a problem that you believe is very real, but which nobody else seems to be able to see, which people are telling you doesn't exist? I didn't think I could solve the problem overnight, but I thought, what if I could get people to see it? What if I could force people to acknowledge the problem? What if I could try and banish some of those dismissals and refusals to believe women by giving other people the experience I'd had, where you hear so many of these stories all together that it forces you to acknowledge that there clearly is a structural problem, that it isn't just one individual making something up or overreacting or taking the wrong end of the stick or not being able to take a compliment. And I thought, would it be possible to replicate this online? So I started a very simple project where I invited people to share their experiences in the hope that we could build up a data set that would do just that. And I expected and hoped that perhaps if 50 people shared their stories, there would be something concrete to point to say, look, this really is a genuine problem. What actually happened took me completely by surprise. Within just a few years, we had 200,000 stories, and the project became and remains the largest data set of its kind that had ever been collected. Suddenly, the project was being picked up in first the national and then the international press, discussed everywhere from the New York Times to the Times of India. And stories began to pour in from people in really diverse walks of life, from incredibly different backgrounds. Stories from a reverend in the Church of England who was constantly being asked if perhaps there was a man available to perform the wedding or the funeral ceremony, to a woman in the city who was told to sit on her boss's lap if she wanted her Christmas bonus, to a man who was patronizingly congratulated for babysitting his own children, to a girl who was kicked off the football pitch at school and told that football wasn't for girls, to a boy who was ridiculed for wanting to take drama GCSE, to a DJ who said that constant groping and harassment had made her come to dread a job that she'd once loved. And as time went on, we started hearing from women in countries around the world saying, we've heard about what you're doing and we need this here. People who had stories like the woman in Argentina who tried to ignore the four men catcalling her from their car, only to find that they screeched to a halt and tried to drag her in. Or the woman in Mexico who was told by her university professor, Calladita te ves más bonita, you look prettier when you shut up. The woman in Germany who said that when she went out at night, having her bottom and crotch groped was so common, she just used the word normal to describe it. The 12 and 16-year-old sisters who were trying to picnic in a public park in France when a man came and exposed himself to them. The woman in India too afraid to report the man with the erection pressed into her back on the bus. And as time went on and as we amassed this enormous data set, we were able, alongside the initial awareness raising impact of the project, to start pulling out lessons and themes and to start learning more about the nature of the problem and about its possible solutions. And everything that the project has done since has been very directly informed by those lived experiences and by the kind of patterns and data points that come out of it. And a lot of it is about connections. It's very clear when you look at these stories that there are connections between the apparently minor things, the stuff that we're told to brush off and not to make a fuss about, the sexist jokes and comments, the wolf whistles and street harassment, the betrayal of women in the media, things like page 3, things that we're liable to be told that we're overreacting if we raise them, and the more serious issues from workplace discrimination to sexual abuse. Because you can see how the creation of an attitude, a kind of shared behavioral mindset towards women in our society by those kind of low-level normalized things lends itself to a kind of fertile ground, if you like, from which the more serious abuses are more readily able to spring, that they contribute to jokes about sexual violence that make survivors less likely to feel confident in coming forward to report what's happened. Or that, as you can see very clearly in some of the project entries, one thing sort of twists and merges into another. So what starts out as an instance of just street harassment, just wolf whistling, might suddenly morph into something else when a woman dares to reject it or ignore it and enrages the perpetrator to such an extent that she's followed home and sexually assaulted on her own doorstep. That isn't to say that we should treat them all in the same way, but rather that we have to be allowed to look at the nuance and at the complexity of this context and the impact it has. And it became very clear from the entries as well that there were connections between the stories we were receiving about sexism and also about other forms of prejudice. Because stories were pouring in that showed people in their lived experience who were going through not only sexism, but also coming up against homophobia, racism, anti-Semitism. And these weren't separate, neatly compartmentalized experiences, as much as our society likes to suggest that they are separate, compartmentalized problems. Because, of course, people who live at the intersection of these different forms of prejudice, of these different inequalities, were experiencing them in an intersectional and a cumulative way. So what that looked like in practice was a woman who told us she'd been shouted at in the street and told to do a pole dance around her walking stick. A Black woman who was in an interview when the interviewer started describing to her his fantasies about what he described as spicy and exotic Black women. An Asian woman who was on campus with her university boyfriend when people started shouting at him, asking if she was a mail order bride. Women who were out with their female partners and would find that men would follow them, asking if they could videotape them or join in. Older women who again and again used the word invisible in their project entries. And it became very clear then that in order to build viable solutions for the problem, whether it was in public spaces or in the workplace, that intersection had to be taken into account if it was going to be a solution that was fit for purpose for everybody. And again, very clearly, the connections came out between the stories that we were hearing from men and boys and those from women and girls. A really good example of this was a week where in the same week we received a story from a woman who was told that she wouldn't be considered for a promotion because she was seen as a maternity risk, and a man who asked for extended parental leave to spend time with his new baby and was not only denied it, but also really ridiculed at work simply for having asked, which is such a clear example of the same outdated stereotype about gender roles and who should be making money and who should be raising the baby, having a massive detrimental impact on the careers of both men and women. So they really brought home that idea that this is about everybody, this is about people standing up to prejudice. And indeed, some of the things that we were sent made it very clear that this wasn't even just a case of one person doing something to another person, but that the normalization of sexism and attitudes towards women and girls are baked into the society around us in more insidious and complex ways, which might be harder to notice. For example, the fact that we might see a headline in the business section of one of our biggest newspapers, which tends to be reported very much in the same way every time a story happens of a high profile, well-qualified person moving from one firm to another. Except that when you see the same story reported in the same newspaper, but the person in question is a woman, there's something rather different about the way in which the story is told and angled. It might be even the kind of thing that you don't necessarily stop to notice, that it just kind of sinks in subliminally. Perhaps you click onto a website looking for a van company to move house and you think there's something's not quite right there. It's ringing a bit of a bell, but perhaps you wouldn't even put your finger on it if it weren't being presented to you as a problem. And of course, what that means is that these things begin to seep into our public consciousness, particularly the things that we see over and over and over again, which is very much the case for images of women's bodies. We see around 1,000 pictures of women's bodies a week, everywhere from the billboard to the side of a bus, to coming up the escalator out of a tube station, to flicking through a magazine, to perhaps even the side of your sandwich packet that you pick up in Boots for lunch. There might be a woman in a bikini there. And when our brain sees something 1,000 times, it's very easy for it to tell us, I know exactly what that thing looks like, to the extent that we don't even necessarily really see the images anymore. Our brain thinks very confidently that it knows exactly what woman looks like. And it's a very short step from there to what women perhaps should look like, or even how they should be judged or valued. But it's only when you stop to put those images side by side, which of course we never do in real life, that we suddenly stop and realize I haven't seen 1,000 women's bodies this week at all. I've seen one woman's body 1,000 times, because it's the same very thin, long-legged, white-skinned, long blonde-haired, usually heavily made up young woman presented to me with that label of what woman is, even though it encapsulates the tiniest percentage of the reality of women's bodies. And this begins to have more of an impact, of course, when pieces of that body are taken out of context and displayed to us to sell completely unrelated products, whether it might be a burger or a betting website, at which point, with the head of the woman conveniently left out of the picture so you don't quite have to remember she's a human being at all, when you're not selling moisturizer or women's underwear, at which point there isn't any reason really to use a piece of a woman's body except to send the message, take, sell, want. This is something consumable. This is something that's there for the taking, and all you have to do is decide that you want to make it yours. And of course, that isn't to say for 1 second that somebody looks at one advert like this and goes out and commits a sexual assault. Of course, it's far more complex than that. But if you look at this all together, if you take into account every one of these tiny pinpricks, you start to see a broader context in which our brains are repeatedly being sent the message that we should see women first and foremost through this lens of whether or not she's sexually attractive, whether or not men would want to sleep with her, regardless of who she is or why we're hearing about her. And perhaps you think that sounds like a bit of an exaggeration. Perhaps you think, well, hang on a minute, there are women in the public eye for really serious reasons that have nothing to do with their looks, and we don't necessarily always talk about how sexy they are. But the reality is that even in cases as extreme as that, that is very much what happens every single time, whether it's a woman who's been accused of murder or a woman who has herself been murdered, like Reva Steenkamp pictured here on the front page of The Sun, the way they chose to portray her the morning after she'd been shot dead, with a headline that didn't even mention her name. And of course, this is something that has a real life impact. It impacts our politicians, women whose looks and sexual attractiveness have absolutely nothing to do with their ability to do their jobs, and yet who find themselves confronted with coverage that again and again reduces them to their body parts and their appearance. Not just in the occasional cartoon section where you might also see Boris Johnson's hair being made fun of or something like that, but even at incredibly important moments, like the pinnacle of their career. These women, for example, had just been promoted to the cabinet when the biggest newspaper in the country described them as girls on a catwalk and informed us about their makeup, their legs, their shoes, and their hair, treatment which, as you can see, was not meted out to their male colleagues. And again, this is about joining the dots, not in a kind of direct and simplistic way, not saying that this piece of coverage is solely responsible for the fact that just a third of our MPs are women, but looking at the bigger picture and starting to question the impact it has if this is the information we're given about female MPs on voting choices further down the line. And of course, that's something that's quite deliberately weaponized. This isn't just benign. It isn't something that just happens by accident. We see it being very deliberately used as a weapon against women, as in these mainstream national press examples of portrayals of Nicola Sturgeon purely using the fact that she is a woman as a weapon with which to undermine the reader's idea of her suitability for political office without actually in any way engaging with her policies or politics. The trouble is that it's very difficult to disrupt something when it starts from such an incredibly young age that we're all sort of swimming in it from birth. We are sent messages from birth about who we are, about what our likely strengths and weaknesses might be, about what we're expected to be interested in, about our potential aspirations, purely based on our sex. It's something that continues throughout childhood, whether it's in the toys that we're given, the labeling on toys in toy stores, even the fact that we might go through the supermarket with our parents and see in the magazine aisle that even now in our biggest supermarkets, you'll see women's magazines and men's magazines as the labels. And underneath women's magazines, you'll see diet and gossip and celebrity mags, and under the title men's magazines you'll see The Economist, The New Scientist, The National Geographic. You'll see politics, economics, science, history, all being labelled as things which are for men. And by the time you reach A level, at almost half of all state secondary schools, there are no girls at all studying physics. So you start to wonder what the impact of these messages might be, particularly in a world which tells us that all of this is a woman's problem to fix. And we saw a lot of this recently in the outcry and the media coverage surrounding the death of Sarah Everard. We saw a lot of people sharing she did all the right things and she was just walking home, as if that somehow should have protected her, as if had she not been, her death would have been any less of a tragedy, as if women could simply learn just the right formula of things to wear, things to do and not to do, the right route to take to protect themselves from sexual violence and from violence. And this is an incredibly common perception in our society, and it stands in the way of our progress to tackle these things, because it tells us that it's not men's job, that it's not in men's interest, that it's nothing to do with them. It tells us, and you can see from this example of this poster, even in well-meaning campaigns coming from the police or from universities and institutions, that women should protect themselves, that girls shouldn't wear short skirts, that they should avoid wearing heels so that they can run if they need to, that they shouldn't take unlicensed minicabs, that they shouldn't be alone in the wrong place at the wrong time, they should travel in groups, take safer routes, stick to the well-lit paths, not cut through an alleyway, not drink too much, watch their drinks, go to the bathroom in groups, text each other when they get home safely. The millions and millions of things that women around the world do on a daily basis, almost without thinking about it, to protect themselves from violence. Things that have not necessarily crossed men's minds, things that men might be shocked to realize that the women in their lives are doing on a day-to-day basis. And the most tragic part of it all is that it doesn't work. We know that women all over the world are raped at all different times of day, wearing all different kinds of clothing, including completely covered from head to toe, at all different ages, from babyhood to elderly women in their 80s. We know that the only thing they have in common isn't some great mistake that they made, it's the fact that they came into contact with a man who made a deliberate choice to be the perpetrator of a crime. And until we flip that narrative on its head, it will always be difficult to tackle the problem because we're looking for the solution in the wrong place. Just statistically, it doesn't add up. It doesn't make sense because we know that 85% of rapists are already known to their victims. We know that rape isn't a sudden unbearable attraction to a woman in a short skirt that sends an otherwise completely normal man into a crazy fit of lust. We know that it's about power and control. We know it's a deliberate act. It's incredibly insulting to the vast majority of men to suggest that rape is about a man losing control around a woman in a short skirt. But we also know statistically that a woman is likely safer at home in her bed in her pajamas than she is passed out drunk in an alleyway wearing a short skirt at 2 o'clock in the morning, because she is far more likely to come to harm at the hands of a colleague, a husband, a partner, a friend. And what that means is that this is on all of us, that it is in all of our interests, but also all of our responsibility to be tackling this, because it isn't something shadowy in a dark alleyway that's inevitable and always waiting to befall silly women. It's a deliberate choice being made by people within our society, by people that we know, not by shadowy strangers in dark alleyways. So it's difficult because, as well as tackling an invisible problem, we also have to tackle societal mores and assumptions about what's preventing us from reaching a solution. And this is also particularly true in the workplace. If you look at the stories that we've received from women in the workplace, it's actually the single highest category of everyday sexism project entries that we receive, which I think a lot of people would find fairly shocking, particularly considering how prevalent street harassment is, for example. It ranges from sexual harassment from clients in public facing roles, from colleagues, to inappropriate questions in interviews about childcare and family planning. It can happen face to face, but it can also happen digitally. It might be, for example, an experience like a woman who wrote to say that her colleagues had initiated something called Porn Fridays, where every Friday they photoshopped their female colleagues' faces onto porn images and emailed them around the office. It might be about pornography being sent unsolicited. It might be inappropriate questions about somebody's sex life, about their sexual appearance. It might be sexual jokes. It might take place in the office, but it also might take place at conferences or at parties or events. It was, in other words, much broader, I think, than many people think when we talk about workplace sexual harassment or discrimination. And it was also hidden. It's the area where people are most resistant to acknowledging that there's a problem, because so many people want to believe that this stuff simply couldn't happen in the workplace. There are assumptions that there must simply be processes in place and that this stuff therefore simply wouldn't be possible to be going on. There are assumptions that women must be making it up, must be looking for attention. But in reality, the opposite is true. It's also the place it's least likely to be reported. Women are terrified that they won't be taken seriously, that they won't be believed, that they'll face negative career repercussions as a result of coming forward. And there's very often a power imbalance where somebody in a position of power or control over a junior person's career is able to abuse that power to act with impunity. And the evidence isn't just anecdotal. So those are some of the examples of stories that we've heard. But when you look at the statistics, you can see that over half of all women and 2/3 of young women have experienced workplace sexual harassment, that 1 in 8 have experienced unwanted sexual touching or attempts to kiss them at work. In other words, that 1 in 8 women are experiencing sexual assault in the workplace. So it isn't just the minor stuff. It isn't just people overreacting. And of course, what we know is that just having processes in place, just having laws in place isn't enough to prevent it happening. Maternity discrimination is illegal, but 54,000 women every year, around 1 in 8 of all pregnant women, are still estimated to lose their jobs because of maternity discrimination. And there is still a huge lack of confidence in reporting processes and in the lack of assumptions that companies will support or believe workers. Just 20% feel able to report the sexual harassment that they face in the workplace. Now, very often, on seeing that statistic, people say, well, why don't women just report it? If more women reported it, then we'd be able to fix it. Problem solved. What's really important to note is that in that same report that revealed that over half of women experienced it and only 20% felt able to report, we looked into statistics around what happened to those who did report it. 3/4 said that nothing changed, and another 16% on top of that said they were treated worse as a result. In other words, for 90% of those who report workplace sexual harassment, the outcome is either that things remain the same or that they get worse. So it's really important, I think, to look at how we fix the structures and the procedures in place before we call on people to feel more willing to come forward. And there is absolutely a business case for tackling this. It's not just a moral case. It's not just about doing the right thing or about supporting women and others who experience sexual harassment in the workplace. There's also a massive cost to employers, so it makes sense to tackle this. It can lead to high staff turnover, just as women adopt unofficial coping mechanisms in their daily lives to deal with these things. So the same is true in the workplace. Somebody who's experiencing sexual harassment at work but doesn't necessarily feel able to report it is likely to undertake their own coping mechanisms, whether that might be avoiding particular projects, withdrawing, taking themselves off a particular work stream, being less likely to volunteer, to put themselves forward. It has a negative impact in terms of staff performance. It can have a massive impact on mental health, which can lead to absences and even lead to people choosing to leave, which obviously then can lead to a leaky pipeline of female talent. And of course, it can become a vicious circle. By every metric and across research by Deloitte, by McKinsey, by Catalyst, again and again, it's been shown that companies that tackle sexual harassment and increase equality and diversity, particularly at senior levels, see much, much better performance across the board by any metric that you choose to use. So this is something that really is in everybody's interest to tackle. So how do you go about it? Well, for employers and organizations, I think it's really important to have that focus on fixing the solutions before you encourage people to come forward. I'd really encourage people to move away from an individual notion of the problem and its solutions towards a structural one. In other words, rather than saying, what should individual women do to cope if they experience this in the workplace? Or what should we encourage victims to say? Or how should we encourage them to tackle it? To switch instead to a mindset of how can we prevent this happening in the first place, and what should we be doing to provide a situation where victims and survivors feel confident coming forward to report. That might mean introducing anonymous helplines where people are able to report things that are going on in the workplace. If so, then I'd very much say that that should be from a victim-centered approach. In other words, the person reporting should have control over the process as far as possible. They might want to report something without taking it any further. They might want to anonymously report something. There should be flexibility built into the process. It might be easy, for example, for a workplace to think that they have an excellent sexual harassment policy in place, but if it demands that the person experiencing it report it directly to their line manager, for example, which is not uncommon and doesn't offer any other alternative, then you've really fallen at the first hurdle, given the fact that we know in a very large number of cases it might be a manager who is actually the person perpetrating the sexual harassment in the first place. So taking a victim-centered approach is incredibly important, and then making sure that everybody knows what those procedures and policies are, what their reporting options are, making them as accessible as possible, and making sure that everybody in an organization knows about their own responsibilities as well as their rights. Training so that when people do come forward and report things, they are properly supported is incredibly important. We receive a huge number of reports from people who have screwed up their courage and gone to report sexual harassment and have had really, really bad responses as a result. One woman, for example, was sexually assaulted whilst at a conference with a work colleague. And when she reported it to the person who was in charge of HR for that particular activity, they conspiratorially winked at her and said, I hear he's recently been divorced, so we should be understanding. So it's really important that that training is in place as well, and recognizing how complex the issue can be. It's also really important that you're keeping track of what's happening in terms of sexual harassment, in terms of reporting, in terms of outcomes, to avoid, for example, repeated behavior from the same person or particular patterns emerging, and to enable you to tackle them as and when they do. And of course, this can't be separated from other best practice around issues like flexible working, shared parental leave, maternity pipeline support, because these are all part of the same bigger picture, if you like, of equality and diversity, and enabling more women to be there, positions in senior leadership, for example, which can help to therefore extend this process further. So it's very complex, and these things are all closely interconnected, but there are some very clear and specific best practices that organizations can take away. And there is also a lot that individuals can do. I do think it's important that we see this as a systemic structural issue with systemic structural solutions. But alongside that, we also know that those structural changes don't work unless there's cultural shift, unless there's willingness from individuals to work with them. And buy-in from the top is incredibly important on this, role modeling from senior leadership to make it clear that actually this is a priority, that this is something that's taken seriously throughout the company, that it's not just a tick box exercise that's never mentioned again. And for individuals, I think what I'd say is that this can feel quite overwhelming, and there can be a sense of, oh, there's nothing I could do. I couldn't make a difference. This isn't really my problem. I shouldn't get involved. But of course, it's that kind of culture that has enabled abuse traditionally to flourish in situations where everybody turns a blind eye and looks the other way. The fact that behavior like Harvey Weinstein's was such an open secret within his industry is a very good example of this. Everybody can say something if they see something. Everybody should feel empowered by those organizational structures and processes to know that they can take action if they feel that it's necessary. And it doesn't have to be a huge accusation or a confrontation. It might be about supporting victims, letting them know that you've seen something that isn't appropriate and that you'd support them if they wanted to make a report. It might be about a quiet conversation off the record with somebody, encouraging them to do something a little bit differently. It might be about challenging small things because they do add up and create a broader context. And to give you an example of what I mean about taking small action within your own specific sphere, we recently heard from a man who was very junior in his company, and he had a female colleague who at every meeting they attended together was being asked to make coffee for everybody and to take the notes. And she felt he knew that she was being perceived in a sort of secretarial role as a result. She wasn't being considered for particular big projects, she hadn't been considered for promotion, but he also knew that she didn't want to report it officially because she felt that she'd be seen as making a fuss. And he thought, what can I do? I'm not in a position of power to tackle this. I can't report it because she doesn't want to report it. And then he suddenly realized there was something that was within his power to do. And he started turning up at the meetings a couple of minutes early and volunteering to make the coffee and take the notes, which didn't have the same negative impact on perceptions of him in his career because he was a man. So in almost any situation, if you think about it creatively, if you approach it as something that doesn't have to be done in a kind of very specific way, there will be something that each of us can do to be proactive, to tackle these things and to disrupt that normalization. Because for so much of this, it comes back to that idea of what's normal, what do we all accept? And really the question is so simple. It comes back to that day on the bus, whether or not you be the person that stepped up, that said something, or the person who looked out the window. I'm going to stop there, but I think we have a few minutes left. If anybody would like to ask any questions, I'd be very happy to answer them.
Nora, I've got some questions in the chat group, but firstly, I'd like to say what an absolutely incredible and insightful presentation for all the wrong reasons. And again, to the Gender Networks members and everyone that's attended, I never meant to depress you. on a Wednesday. However, going back to something that Laura said in the very, very beginning, I cannot let you look out the window, because this stuff goes on every single day. And I know we have an audience of men and women, and the men are asking in the chat groups, what can we do? And you touched on a few points there. But we wanted to bring this to you because this is real life. This, we could all ignore that this stuff goes on and just carry on with our work, but unless we find a way of tackling it. And I think it was great, Laura, that you kind of gave some insights as to what companies and what individuals can do in the end. So so I know that, I say, we're short of time, so I'm just going to go through a couple of questions. There was a really interesting question that came up that says, if you was giving this presentation, I'm going to generalize it, to an audience full of men, would it have been any different?
I think I might have preempted some of the common kind of knee-jerk defensive reactions that I get, looking at some of the pitfalls, at some of the assumptions. One of the things I always think it's important to kind of emphasize if I'm giving a presentation to a very heavily male audience is that this isn't about pointing fingers. It's actually about a really exciting, positive galvanization, if you like, of the kind of critical mass, because the vast majority of men wouldn't dream of behaving like this, but the vast majority of men also have no idea that this stuff is going on. So I would probably have started from that point and saying, this isn't about telling you off. This isn't about blaming men or tarring all men with the same brush, but it is a challenge, if you like, that you can't really be neutral in this. You can't sit on the fence, and that if you haven't known about this stuff until today, there's a reason for that, which is that you haven't experienced it, which is a privilege you might not necessarily even have been aware of. But now that you know about it, what are you going to do to be part of the solution?
Yeah, absolutely. So Mike asked earlier on, what can he do to be more of a male ally? And I think you've answered some of that. But is there anything else that men can do?
Yeah, so I think lots of things, once men become aware of the problem, then options to challenge it, I think, then become much more obvious to them. So things like offering the coffee in meetings and offering to take the notes might seem like a really odd thing to suggest that men do, because how does that advance gender equality? But actually, we know that women who take on those roles often really struggle to break out of being perceived in a particular way. So that's a really specific practical thing that men can do. But also going into your workplace and just asking what the sexual harassment policy is and what procedures are in place. That's something that can be much easier for men to push for than for women, but it's something that we would always just assume is a woman's job to do, that women will come and ask about. Discussing pay in some cases with female colleagues can be controversial, but actually can be another real way to empower them when it comes to negotiations and pay discussions, trying to tackle the gender pay gap. And I think the last thing is just thinking about situations in which women aren't present and how the conversation goes. And if there is that sense of kind of locker room banter and lads being lads, that's the situation in which men can have an incredibly powerful voice in challenging it and disrupting that normalization and taking some of that burden off women being seen as the kind of whining feminazis. If it's a man who says, actually, I don't think that's appropriate, let's move on, that can be incredibly powerful.
Yeah, I agree. I just want to touch on, I think, education starts with the children. So surely this is conversations with sons and daughters. We saw that rhetoric, when it came out about Sarah Everard, protect your daughters, but educate your sons. What are your thoughts on that?
Absolutely, I couldn't agree more. And again, we have this assumption it's a mum's job to talk to kids about this stuff, but there's no reason why it should be. And I think for sons in particular, for their dads to sit them down and talk about this stuff is really powerful. We can't get every adult man in the world to sit down and listen to this stuff, but we could talk about it to every child before these ideas become too ingrained. So I think that parents have a massive role to play, and adults with important young people in their lives of any relationship as well, in just thinking twice about some of the assumptions that we make. It can be things as tiny as when we see kids that we haven't seen for a while and telling the girl how pretty and beautiful she is and the boy how strong he's growing, all the way through to talking about consent with your sons instead of telling your daughter not to go out in a short skirt. We can flip some of those narratives on their head.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a couple more questions here. What do you think is the biggest lever to affect positive change? Give us some positivity.
Well, there's lots of fantastic positive stuff happening, you know, we can be really, really hopeful on so many different fronts. We're seeing public pressure around this issue and a public conversation that we've never seen before. When I started the project, it was only 10 years ago, not even quite that. And you really just couldn't talk about sexism publicly. People just dismissed you. And now look at the conversations that we're having in the media. You know, we are making progress and moving forward. There are young women all over the country who are standing up and refusing to put up with this anymore, in really, really witty and funny and bold ways. Girls at one school, for example, they were told that they couldn't wear leggings because they might distract the boys in their maths class, and they picketed the school the next day with placards that said, "Are my trousers lowering your test scores?" You know, there are people finding their own ways to stand up, and that's incredibly inspiring and incredibly hopeful. We heard from one man, in fact, he said that he'd been reading project entries about how street harassment made women feel, and he'd never thought about it before, but after that he couldn't stop thinking about it. And he was walking down the street and saw some builders shouting at a woman up ahead of him, and they were shouting, "Get your breasts out." And he said he panicked and he didn't know what to say, so he lifted up his t-shirt and showed them his instead. And it was his way of saying, "You wouldn't do it to me, so don't do it to them." So it might be really small things, but you might stop someone from doing something again. So the ripple effect could be quite big.
I think there's a lot to be said for that line of, that's not acceptable, and sometimes we feel uncomfortable to kind of say it. I mean, just quick one, just most recently, my daughters showed me some slides that was put up in a school in the UK that had an audience of girls telling them about the length of their skirts and that, not to wear low tops because it was distracting to the boys in the school. And I was mortified and horrified. And the temptation is to call that school out, on kind of, but I mean, I sent a polite note to the headmaster and saying, this is on social media, this is why it's not acceptable, and, to look at your policies, but you see it in schools. So just the one for the parents as well, what are your schools sharing around this message to your kids?
Yeah.
Just something to check in on. I'm going to finish on one final question. It's from Lorraine. So, we've all got younger women in our lives, from my perspective, about 160,000 of them. What's our advice to them when they, perhaps you haven't got the confidence to call that out, as you're worried about your job, you're worried about the impact. How do you go about that, especially if you've not particularly got faith in going up the HR route?
Yeah.
What do you do? How do we protect them? What's our advice to them?
Well, I think the first thing I'd say is to arm yourself with information, know what your rights are, know what you have the right to be protected from, because so many of the people who report their stories to us, it's very clear that what they're experiencing completely meets the threshold of workplace sexual harassment or abuse, but they don't know they have the right to be protected from it legally. So empowering them with that information, I think, is really useful. There's a fantastic helpline called Rights of Women, which is legal help and advice for women experiencing sexual harassment in the workplace, and they are brilliant and will give you information and options. And my third piece of advice, I think, would be standing together. Safety in numbers and strength in numbers, because one woman in the workplace very rightly and understandably can fear being scapegoated or being dismissed or being sort of picked out or even losing her job. But 10 women in the same office standing up together and saying there's an issue here and it needs to be resolved, there's real strength in numbers there, and it makes it much more difficult to kind of pick one of them out and try and sort of isolate them. And of course, it shouldn't really just be women. So male colleagues should be standing alongside them and supporting them as well. And the more people who challenge this stuff as a group, the more the chances of tackling it.
So just a couple of things before we, on the workplace discrimination. I mean, on the help sites, there's a wonderful page on the Everyday Sexism website that's got loads of different links for you. From a workplace discrimination, We Are the City, our partners in McAllister Oliveris. We recently done a whole webinar on workplace discrimination, so you can find that on We Are the City. And as I say, more than happy to point anyone in that direction if they want to find out more. So in terms of Laura, one of the things I've been saying on the chat group, we've got this recording, it's for Gender Networks members, and that's great. But I really want you to think about, how do you start this narrative? How do you start this conversation within your own workplace with your own people? So one of the things to consider, have Laura in to speak, get everybody kind of involved, get the guys in the room as well, because I think this has been an eye-opener for all of us. So we're more than happy to connect with Laura, but it just leaves me to say, Laura, it's been an incredible hour with you. I wish you the best of luck with Everyday Sexism. I'm sure if any of us can ever help you in any way, we'll absolutely be there. But I hope all of the members have found this interesting, that it sparks some conversation, and that you have your sexism lens on in kind of everything that you do. Thank you very much, Laura. It's been a pleasure to welcome you. Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you. Thank you for having me.
Thank you for joining us.